An elderly black woman walks through a park like she's done for years, calm, composed, unnoticed, until a young white officer stops her, demands ID, and calls for backup. But what he doesn't know, she's not just any woman. She's a retired federal judge who helped write the very laws he thinks he's enforcing. What happens next will flip the script on power prejudice and presence. This isn't just a walk, it's a reckoning. Dear viewer, what you are about to witness is not just a story, it is a powerful testament to the quiet power and pursuit of justice in places most people ignore. If this is your first time here, I warmly invite you to share where you are watching in the comments below. And if stories like this move you, challenge you, or make you think, consider subscribing and clicking the bell icon. We share voices that deserve to be heard every day. Thank you for being here. Now let's get into the story. The morning sun had just begun to stretch itself across the sleepy streets of Macon, Georgia, when Marion Douglas stepped onto the park path. She wore a brown felt hat that shaded her weathered face, a modest trench coat wrapped tight against the early chill, and low-heeled leather shoes that whispered more than they walked. To most, she would have looked like any other elder taking in a quiet Sunday morning. But those who looked closer might have noticed the way her spine stayed impossibly straight, or how her eyes, though softened by age, carried something far more ancient than time discipline. Precision, history. The park was nearly empty at this hour. A few joggers passed, nodding politely. A boy rode his bike along the curb's edge, calling for his father behind him. Marion nodded at no one, smiled at everyone. She had been coming to this park for years, always the same route. Past the bench under the oak tree, down the gravel path that looped by the Veterans Memorial, then back past the playground where generations had learned how to fall and get up again. But today, the ground beneath her feet felt different. Not physically. Something in the air, like a page about to turn. She slowed near the flagpole where the American flag lifted lazily in the breeze. Her eyes caught its rhythm, and for a moment her breath matched it, steady, controlled. That flag had once meant everything to her. For most of her adult life, she had sworn to defend what it stood for. And she had, with grace, with grit, and with a pen sharper than any sword. But no one around her knew that. They only saw the coat, the wrinkles, the skin. They saw a story they thought they'd written before. Officer Brian Huxley watched from across the lot, his hand resting casually near his utility belt. He had joined the Macon Police Department less than a year ago. Young, ambitious, self-assured. He was good at following hunches, or so he liked to believe. And today, something about the woman in the hat struck him wrong. She kept looking around, not nervously, intently, as if she was casing the park. He crossed the grass toward her boots crunching over fallen leaves. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said. Marion turned slowly. Her gaze rose to meet his level and unflinching. She said nothing. "You live around here?" he asked, voice casual but firm. "I walk here," she replied. The words were plain, not defensive. "Just noticed you've been watching people, taking your time. Everything okay?" "Everything is exactly as it should be." Huxley shifted. He wasn't used to being met with poise, especially not from someone like her. "Can I see some ID?" There it was. The shift. The weight of assumption landing between them like a dropped gavel. Marion didn't move. Her hands stayed in her pockets. "Am I being accused of something?" Huxley paused. This wasn't going like it should. "Not yet," he said. "But it's standard. You match a vague description from an earlier call. Elderly woman, brown coat, seemed out of place. She raised an eyebrow, barely. Out of place. The words hung there. Huxley cleared his throat. It's not personal, just safety protocol. You'd be surprised how often suspicious behavior leads to bigger problems. Marion nodded slowly. And you believe I'm the problem? He shrugged, trying to appear unaffected. I didn't say that. But you didn't have to. The tension didn't rise loudly. It thickened like humidity before a thunderstorm. Marion's stillness wasn't resistance. It was something older, something honed. The kind of control that comes not from submission, but from outliving the need to explain your existence. I'm going to ask you again, ma'am. I need to see some identification. From across the street, a few heads turned. A woman walking her dog slowed. A father by the playground stiffened slightly, unsure of what he was seeing, but certain it was something. Marion slowly reached into her coat, but not for ID. She pulled out a handkerchief, unfolded it, and wiped the rim of her glasses. Then she returned it to her pocket. I think we're done here, she said. No, Huxley said, the tension now creeping into his voice. We're not. If you fail to comply, I may have to detain you. A pause. You're detaining me for walking in a park, for refusing to identify yourself. She gave him a look, then not of challenge, but of profound disappointment, like a professor watching a student cheat on an open book test. Do you know who I am? I don't, he admitted. Exactly, she said. And that's why we're here. He reached for his radio. Dispatch, I've got a possible 1092. Elderly female, non-compliant, requesting unit backup. Backup. For a woman with a handkerchief. The response crackled through copy that Huxley, sending unit. And so it began. Marion turned back toward the flagpole, her eyes calm, her breath steady. She didn't plead. She didn't resist. She stood still. And in that stillness, something began to shake. The foundations of assumption, the illusion of control, the myth that dignity must come with a badge or a name that someone else recognizes. The moment was small, a single walk interrupted. But it would ripple. Because in 2 days' time, when the footage surfaced, when the headlines followed, when Officer Brian Huxley finally learned who Marion Douglas truly was, the woman he'd detained, disrespected, and dismissed, his regret would not come from what he did. It would come from everything he failed to see. And so, the story begins, not with shouts, not with sirens, but with a woman walking like any other, until someone decided she didn't belong, and found out too late. She wrote the rules he thought he was enforcing. The squad car arrived with a slow crawl, tires cracking against the gravel path as if the air itself were reluctant to escalate. Marion Douglas remained exactly where she was standing by the flagpole, eyes, steady coat, buttoned as if she were waiting for a breeze instead of backup. But it wasn't a breeze that arrived. It was another young officer, 20-something, lips tight hand, already near the cuffs on his belt. He looked at Marion like he'd seen 100 versions of her before not realizing this one would end his illusion of certainty. Officer Huxley didn't introduce her when his colleague stepped out. He just gestured with a nod. This is the subject. Subject. That word used to refer to case files, defendants, anonymous reports, and criminal complaints. It was never meant for someone like Marion. And yet here she was, retired federal judge, former counsel to the State Department, decorated for civilian service in the post-9/11 International Court tribunals, reduced in a single moment to subject. Ma'am, the second officer said, less rigid, less eager. We've received a call. We just need to verify who you are. Do you have ID? Marion nodded this time, but slowly. I do. But the question is, what made you think I needed to show it? The younger officer hesitated. Just policy. That's not a policy, she replied. That's an instinct. And the most dangerous thing about instinct is how often it's dressed up as procedure. She reached into her coat, retrieved her leather wallet, and unfolded it with care. Inside, beside her license and military spouse, ID, was a laminated certificate Department of Justice credentials from her time as senior federal judge. She didn't flaunt it. She didn't even hold it up. She simply opened it to the page where her name title and clearance were printed in unshakable black. The officer took one look. His face changed. Oh. Huxley stepped closer. What is it? The second officer's voice lowered. She's a federal judge. Retired. Silence hung there. The kind of silence that doesn't ask for forgiveness, it demands reevaluation. Marion tucked the wallet back into her coat. The problem, she said softly, is not that you didn't know who I was. It's that you didn't care to ask before deciding who I might be. She turned her back to them, not out of disrespect, but because the moment had already passed its chance for dignity. The damage wasn't the request for ID. It was everything before it. The narrowing of eyes, the hand on the belt, the unspoken assumption that a black woman alone in a park must be out of place. Huxley said nothing. He had been trained for confrontation, trained for control, but he had not been trained for consequence. I'm sorry, ma'am, the second officer said quietly. Marion didn't answer. She had spent a lifetime in courtrooms where the word sorry was a tactic, not an apology, and she didn't need it now. By the time she walked home, the neighborhood had already begun to buzz. A local teenager had filmed part of the encounter from a nearby bench, and within hours the clip hit social media, an elderly woman, surrounded by officers, standing with the stillness of someone who knew too well what this country does to the composed. The video didn't show her badge. It didn't need to. People could feel the insult, could see it in the way her shoulders never dipped into fear, could hear it in the controlled way she answered, and once her name began to circulate, the outrage wasn't just over the incident, it was over the pattern. Because for every Marion Douglas, there had been a dozen others without the titles, without the laminated justice, whose stories ended not in quiet return, but in escalation, in arrest, in harm. Reporters began calling. A local news anchor reached out for a statement. A cable outlet requested an interview. Marion refused them all. Because she didn't need the spotlight, she needed reflection, not hers, the public's. 2 days later, the Macon Police Department issued a vague statement calling the encounter an unfortunate misunderstanding and pledging to review community engagement protocols. But they didn't mention her name. They didn't mention that they'd misjudged the very woman who helped write the community engagement protocols they now claim to review. And still, Marion said nothing. She simply walked the same park route the following Sunday. Same coat, same hat, same flagpole. But something had changed. As she passed the playground, the father who had watched from afar that morning gave her a solemn nod. A young girl on a scooter whispered to her mom, "Is that the judge lady?" An older black man, sitting on a bench near the Veterans Memorial, tipped his cap. None of them needed a speech. Her walk had become a statement. her stillness a symbol. And Huxley, he watched from a patrol car parked across the street, eyes lowered, hands still. Because once you learn who someone really is, once you realize how badly you got it wrong, not just the mistake, but the assumption that allowed it, there's no protocol for the weight of that recognition. Marion didn't need an apology. She needed them to carry the weight of their misjudgment. And from that day forward, whether they knew it or not, they did. Marion Douglas didn't sleep that night. Not out of fear. She'd grown far too familiar with the anatomy of injustice to be rattled by its symptoms, but from something more insidious memory. She sat near the window of her modest home arms, folded a cup of tea, long gone cold, beside her. Outside, the world looked the same. Porch lights flickered. A dog barked in the distance. Someone laughed on a nearby porch. But in her chest, something trembled. Not because she had been humiliated, but because she knew how easily things could have gone differently. Not everyone left such encounters alive. By morning, her front porch was dotted with newspaper clippings. Someone had slipped one under the door, the local editorial, with her photo grainily captured from the now viral video. The headline didn't scream, but it didn't whisper either. Federal judge confronted in Park, a case of mistaken identity or something older. She didn't answer the door when reporters knocked. She didn't respond to messages from advocacy groups or legal associations. Instead, she reviewed the statement issued by the police department. It was brief, sanitized, stripped of humanity. The department regrets any distress caused during a standard protocol encounter involving a retired public servant. No mention of her name. No acknowledgement of who she was or what they had done. Standard protocol. She had written the damn standard. In 2011, Judge Marion Douglas co-authored the Judicial Oversight Recommendations for Use of Force Encounters, a framework adopted in 23 states. She'd spoken at conferences, testified before Congress. Her fingerprints were in the very fabric of what proper procedure should look like. But none of that mattered when she was walking alone in a park with skin that told a different story than her credentials ever could. Later that afternoon, Grace Bennett came to visit. Her goddaughter, a sharp attorney full of fire and contradiction, the kind of woman Marion had once been before time taught her how to turn anger into architecture. "I filed the motion," Grace said, not asking for permission. Marion raised an eyebrow. "What kind Freedom of Information Act? I want their body cam footage, the radio logs, and I'm drafting a formal complaint." "I don't want a spectacle," Marion said softly. Grace bristled. "You didn't cause a spectacle. They did." "I didn't say I was afraid of noise," Marion replied. "I said I wasn't interested in repeating what they already refused to hear." Grace sat across from her. "Then why not say something? Why not remind them who you are?" Marion paused. Then carefully, "Because they didn't mistake me for no one. They decided I was." There it was. The truth that made Grace's stomach turn. The realization that this wasn't about oversight or unfamiliarity. It was about something deeper, more dangerous, the casual ease with which power denied dignity when it didn't recognize the face carrying it. Marion stood and walked to the mantel. On it sat a black and white photo of her father, military uniform, crisp, his medals slightly tilted on his chest. He had returned from Korea to a country that thanked him with suspicion. She had grown up watching him walk a little slower when police passed, even though he never broke a rule in his life. not because he feared arrest, but because he understood that recognition was a luxury not always afforded. I've sat across from war criminals, Marion said, eyes still on the photograph. I've ruled against billionaires. I've reinterpreted laws that governed entire states. But the moment I'm in a park, without a robe or a title, I'm seen as a problem to be solved, not a person to be respected. Grace looked down. What do we do? Marion turned back to her. We remember that this isn't about what they see. It's about what they refuse to learn. And we decide whether our grace is conditional or constant. The doorbell rang. It was a young black woman in her early 20s, dressed in a college hoodie, holding a notebook awkwardly in her hand. I'm sorry to bother you, she said. I I saw what happened. I'm a journalism student. I just wanted to say thank you. Marion nodded. You don't have to thank me. I do, the girl replied. Because you stayed calm, because you didn't flinch, and because you made it clear that we're allowed to exist without permission. The girl handed her the notebook page, a handwritten quote. Power doesn't always wear uniforms. Sometimes it just walks with its chin up and doesn't apologize for taking up space. Marion's eyes scanned the words. Her chest tightened, not with pride, but with the fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, this generation would push the story further than hers had managed. That night, Marion returned to the park, alone, no cameras, no ceremony. She sat on the same bench, in the same coat, near the same flagpole. And slowly, one by one, people began to approach. A teacher who said her students cried watching the video. An older man who carried a Purple Heart and told her he'd been stopped in the same park last year for loitering. A teen who said, I didn't think they could do that to someone like you. Marion simply listened, because power had failed to recognize her. But the people hadn't, and in that, she saw a different kind of justice begin to unfold, one not defined by legal codes or courtroom rulings, but by the slow and steady remembering of a nation reckoning with its own assumptions. She had always believed in the law, but now she understood that law alone couldn't hold a country together. Recognition could. And maybe, just maybe, they were starting to see. The clip was only 34 seconds long. Shaky hands, harsh midday light, a tremor in the voice of the person recording as the officer reached for his belt. A black woman in a brown coat standing firm near a park bench, arms folded, lips pressed, not moving. The camera jolted at the moment he raised his voice. Ma'am, I'm giving you a lawful order. Then the flash of a hand grazing the holster, and then her voice, clear as a bell through the static. I wrote the law you're trying to enforce. It was uploaded anonymously. By dusk, it had gone viral. By midnight, Marion Douglas's name was trending across every platform. The comments came in waves. Some were furious, some stunned, others hollow with recognition. There were people who had never heard of her before: the former federal judge, the architect, behind multiple civilian oversight reforms, the recipient of the 2015 Presidential Medal of Justice. And there were others who knew exactly who she was and still couldn't believe she'd been treated that way. But Marion wasn't reading the comments. She was at home stirring soup on the stove as if the internet hadn't erupted. Grace was pacing in the living room, her phone buzzing every 5 seconds. Legal scholars, national media, a senator's office, all requesting comment, all demanding context. But Marion, as always, moved slower than the storm. They want you to speak, Grace said, barely containing her urgency. Of course they do. Marion replied calmly, ladling broth into 2 bowls, because silence from someone like me makes them nervous. You were humiliated, Judge. I was reminded Marion corrected her, reminded that the title doesn't change the gaze, and that the truth, when caught on camera, always finds its own volume. By morning, the story had moved beyond social media. Major news outlets aired segments with her courthouse photo on split screens beside body cam analysis. They played the footage over and over, often in slow motion, dissecting every second with dramatic music and talking heads. Some framed it as a tragic misunderstanding. Others didn't bother with euphemisms. An officer's fear was louder than her credentials. One anchor said bluntly, "Veteran organizations issued statements of support. Judges across the country, black, brown, white, signed an open letter condemning the encounter. The National Bar Association requested a federal review. Even the White House was reportedly monitoring the situation closely. But still, Marion refused interviews. She had no interest in becoming a symbol. Because symbols are worshipped in hindsight and forgotten in practice. Instead, she spent that week replying to letters. Not the formal ones from institutions or politicians, but the handwritten ones. The high school student from St. Louis who said, "I didn't know judges could look like you." The elderly veteran from Baltimore who wrote, "They did this to me in '78. You standing there made me feel like I didn't imagine it." The young mother from Detroit who whispered in her letter, "My son saw you," and asked, "Why are they scared of her just standing?" I didn't know how to answer. And it was in those words, scribbled and raw, that Marion found the only version of justice she believed in anymore: recognition that came without demand. Meanwhile, the city's police department scrambled. The official who had issued the original bland statement now faced cameras with quivering lips. "We take this matter seriously," he said. "A full investigation is underway. The officer involved has been placed on administrative leave pending review." But the damage had already outpaced bureaucracy, because people weren't just angry at what had happened. They were angry at how familiar it felt. On a podcast, a retired detective said, "This wasn't about policy. This was muscle memory." That officer saw presence as a threat, because he was never trained to see dignity in black stillness. A quiet revolution had begun to stir. Law schools incorporated the footage into criminal procedure discussions. Churches held Sunday forums titled Authority and Assumption. A museum in D.C. requested to archive the original video as part of a permanent exhibit on modern civil rights. But through it all, Marion remained unmoved by headlines, because the headlines would fade. They always did. She sat on her porch one evening, wrapped in a wool shawl, the same one her mother used to wear to church. Grace joined her, handing over a fresh mug of tea. "You should know," Grace said, "they're planning a march. Students, lawyers, a bunch of veterans. They want to walk through the park in silence, just like you did." Marion looked out at the horizon, dusk turning the sky a bruised lavender. "Let them walk," she said. "Shouldn't you be there?" Marion shook her head. "They don't need me at the front. They need to know they can lead themselves." And maybe that was the legacy she cared for most, not to be the face of outrage, but the catalyst of reflection. Because the nation hadn't just found out what had happened to her. It had been forced to confront how easily it could happen to anyone, not because the person lacked credentials, but because the system lacked curiosity. And when power refuses to ask, "Who are you?" before acting, it reveals more about itself than any policy ever could. It wasn't a courtroom. It wasn't a press conference. It wasn't even the marble steps of the Capitol. It was a park bench, wooden splintering slightly at the edges beneath the same tree where everything had unfolded. The wind rustled through the leaves as if remembering, and Marion Douglas sat exactly where she had stood days before, not seeking closure, but clarity. Children played nearby. A teacher led a small group to the newly installed plaque at the foot of the path. No name, no date, just 10 engraved words. She stood still so others could move forward freely. One girl read it aloud, her voice soft but certain. Marion didn't turn to watch. She didn't need to. She had become part of something larger than herself quietly, without consent or ambition. Not a movement, not a cause, but a pause. The kind that forces a nation to inhale and reconsider what it thought it knew about power presence and prejudice. Grace sat beside her coat collar, turned up against the breeze. She didn't speak at first. She had learned by now that Marion's silence wasn't emptiness, it was architecture. A structure holding up everything that had collapsed around them. And now it felt sacred. They're changing the training manual, Grace finally said. The Academy's adding a module on implicit bias response, real-time case studies. Your video is the opening. Marion didn't flinch. That won't fix it. No, Grace agreed. But it tells the next recruit that stillness isn't defiance. That presence doesn't need permission. A beat passed. That matters, she added. Marion nodded once. Later that afternoon, a reporter called for the 5th time. Then a publisher. Then a civil rights foundation offering to name a fellowship in her honor. She declined all of it. Not because she was ungrateful, but because she understood how quickly truth becomes diluted when filtered through applause. She didn't want to be remembered because a gun had once pointed at her. She wanted to be remembered for how she refused to move. And not out of pride, but out of principle. Because dignity doesn't perform. It simply remains. Weeks passed. Policies were updated. The officer resigned before disciplinary proceedings began. No apology was issued, not really. Just procedural phrases designed to quiet public anger. But the story outlasted the press cycle, not because of outrage, but because it offered something rarer. Reflection. A high school in Alabama held an assembly in her honor. A mural appeared on a brick wall in Detroit, a silhouette of a black woman holding a folded flag, eyes closed, surrounded by words like composure, power, grace. In a Boston courtroom, a black judge paused before delivering a ruling and quoted Marion without attribution, "Let the stillness speak." But Marion didn't return to the spotlight. She walked her same path through the park. She answered letters. She cooked too much soup and gave it away to neighbors. And sometimes she simply sat on that same bench beneath that same tree and watched people pass. One morning, a boy no older than 10 walked up to her. He held his mother's hand, but looked at Marion with a kind of reverence that defied his age. "Are you the lady from the video?" he asked. Marion smiled gently. "I'm someone who stood still when it mattered." The boy nodded, satisfied. Then he asked, "Did it work?" Grace, standing nearby, held her breath. Marion looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "It's working." He grinned, then ran off toward the swings. That was enough. Because legacies aren't built in noise. They're carved in the moments where the world wants you to shrink and you don't. They're made in benches and sidewalks and small hands pointing at plaques. They echo in classrooms, in shift briefings, in the conversations we now have, because silence once refused to surrender. Marion Douglas didn't demand to be seen. She simply stayed where she had the right to be. And because she did, the country had to decide at last how it would answer the stillness in the quiet aftermath of a walk that was never meant to make headlines. The world came to know the name Marion Douglas, not because she sought recognition, but because her stillness forced everyone else to stop. A former federal judge, a veteran, a woman who had written the very policies that once shaped justice in America, Marion found herself misjudged in broad daylight by a man in uniform who had no idea who he was confronting. She wasn't yelling. She wasn't resisting. She was walking, composed, focused, present. And that was enough to trigger suspicion. What followed wasn't just an incident, it was a mirror. A gun was drawn on her, not because of a threat, but because of a mindset. Because to some, the image of a black woman walking with authority still doesn't compute unless accompanied by credentials pinned to her chest or someone else validating her right to exist. But Marion didn't need to prove herself. She had done the work. She had earned the respect. She simply refused to perform for it. Her silence that day wasn't surrender. It was a statement. It was the culmination of a life spent navigating systems that often failed to see her fully. When the news broke, when the footage went viral, when the nation began to ask, how could this happen? The answer was both old and painfully familiar. It had always been happening. The difference this time was that the world was watching. And Marion knew the power of being seen without spectacle. She didn't lash out. She didn't demand the spotlight. She didn't break her composure to make her point. She let the system reveal itself. And in doing so, she taught a country something it desperately needed to relearn, that real justice doesn't always raise its voice. Sometimes it just stands still. So what can we take away from Marion's story? We learn that silence isn't the absence of power. Sometimes it's the purest form of it. In a world trained to equate action with dominance, Marion reminded us that the choice not to move, not to bend, not to explain, can be the most radical act of all. Her story challenges us to confront how often we misjudge people based on appearance, and how deeply bias can shape decisions, even split-second ones. It reminds us that authority without awareness is dangerous, and that credentials mean nothing if the people upholding the law don't understand who the law is meant to protect. And perhaps most importantly, Marion's story shows us the value of living with purpose even when no one is watching, because eventually someone will be. In your own life, whether you're walking through a park, speaking in a meeting, raising your children, or simply showing up as yourself in a space that wasn't built for you, remember this: you don't have to prove your worth to exist with dignity. Stand tall. Stand still when it matters. Speak not just with your voice, but with the integrity of how you carry yourself. Because change doesn't always start with outrage. Sometimes it begins with presence. If Marion's story moved you, if it made you pause, made you reflect, or made you see something differently, don't let it fade. Share this video. Leave a comment. Tell us what part stayed with you. And most of all, subscribe to this channel to support more stories that speak truth, amplify dignity, and remind us that history doesn't just happen in courtrooms or headlines. It happens in quiet moments, in courageous stillness, in people like Marion Douglas. We're not done telling stories like this, and we hope you'll be here for the next one.